My name is Fiffi Myrström. I'm the art curator at Vermlandes Museum. When we talk about Vermlandes Museum, as we are a county museum, we often speak about the task we have, that is to tell the world about Värmland and to tell about the world in Värmland. And at sometimes these are very separate things, and sometimes they are very close together. And I would say that the work with the Jāzeps Grosvalds collection is really an example of when it's both about the world and Värmland and how they are connected. When I started at the museum 4 years ago, I was looking around in the collection and tried to understand what kind of art is it that I'm going to work with now. And I opened a cardboard box and found a lot of portraits of different persons, and I had no idea who had made these and what it was about, but I got a little curious about them. They were so small and fragile on this sketchbook paper, but the people felt so alive, and it was like they were looking at me and was as curious about me as I was about them. Especially the one on the left side there, looking at us with his fingertip and like thinking about, who am I looking at? Who is this? After a while I realized who had made this collection and what it was about, and at the same time we decided to make an exhibition about this collection. For me it's very important that museums collaborate, that we share knowledge, that we share projects, that we share our experience of working. It's both because it's a way of getting to know the world, to be better at our job, but it's also that we have shared responsibilities for what we are preserving, to make sure that things are remembered, to make sure that objects, documents, pictures are kept for us and for the future. And when we see others working with the same kind of materials but in another way, and we start to share our different perspectives on the same material, we start to understand it in a new way, and we start to talk about it in new ways. And I think this is a key for a successful museum. We have to collaborate for doing a relevant story, telling about the story in the history in a relevant way. When it comes to this collection from Jāzeps Grosvaldu, I would say that one of the things that make it so efficient in telling about the history is that it talks about one person's perspective. It's not these big pictures about how, all these fields with a lot of people fighting during a war, that is rather impersonal. You see a lot of things that happen, but you don't really see the feelings. But in Jāzeps Grosvaldu's art, we really meet these people who are affected by the conflicts and war during his travels and during his time in the war. And I think that is one of the reasons why it feels so relevant today. And I also think that he uses a way of depicting the world that we today are using through our cell phones. We take a picture now, a snapshot, we look at the world, this is how I see it, and that is why he is telling it, in the way he's telling it all the time. It's him experiencing this and sharing that experience with us. The Vermlandes Museum got this collection in 1977, but I don't think it was until this book was about to be written that we actually understood what we had. Because in some way this collection was like falling asleep after a while when it had to come to the museum. But as we got contact, my former colleagues got contact with the author of this book, I'm very glad to meet today, we understood the meaning of this collection. We started to understand where it came from and what it meant for others. And it also started us to understand why this was at the museum, when we started to understand our own history and what role the museum had had in the county through the decades. At the same time as I started at the museum, we decided to make an exhibition. The year before, we had lent some of the artworks to here, and this collection was more and more activated. And we opened an exhibition that was called Living for the Moment at the Vermlandes Museum in 2022. And as Dan told you, this is only one of many exhibitions that in one way talks about Latvian art and the connections between Latvia and Sweden. And I would say that we continue to work in this tradition, to continue these contacts. We also continue to understand what the purpose and our work can mean in a bigger perspective. And I don't think that we would have been able to do that by ourselves. Here in Riga, there has been two big exhibitions. You have published a lovely book. We have made an exhibition in Kārlstade. We have published a book, Dan and me have written it. And I would say that in one way, it's very similar products from these different works. But we talk about this art in very different ways. And it's very relevant that we do that together and that we see how do we understand this art here and in Sweden. From year 2017, we have a law in Sweden for the museums. So it's a rather new law. And this talks about what the task for the museums in Sweden is. And it says that we should spread knowledge, make it possible for people to experience art and culture, and to encourage people to make their own opinions, to get knowledge so that they can understand the history from their own perspectives. And I think that this is a very good example of that, because it's also a material that enlightens a lot of very relevant questions when it comes to war, a pandemic, how it is to take care of art and preserve it even in difficult times. And I think that one person that also is very important in this is this woman. We've seen this picture before today. Mary, that worked with preserving art. One of many people at museums all over the world that has taken the challenges that crisis and conflicts and war have given them and worked really hard to preserve the cultural heritage. And I think it's very important to remember what these people actually are doing, because without them, we would not have answers to a lot of questions that we start to ask when we meet the same challenges as has been in the history. Some years ago, 2018, there was a big fire in Brazil where the National Museum burned down. Almost all of their collections were ruined, and I thought a lot about this fire, because every time I hear someone talk about it, they show pictures of the actual fire. And I don't think that the big problem is when the cultural heritage actually is disappearing. The big problem is long after. Because when there is a catastrophe, a fire or a war or anything that damages these objects, documents, pictures, those things that remind us of being curious of what has happened, when they disappear, at first, people still remember what it was that went lost. But after a generation, no one even remember what it was that we lost. So, the longer time it goes, the more difficult it becomes to get access to this, because we stop to remember that it actually was there. So I think it's very, very important to remember the actually very important task that museum has, to make sure that we constantly have the possibility to see our history through these objects and documents and pictures. When we had the exhibition in Kārlstade, we had the privilege of lending a lot of nice art from here, among others, this amazing oil painting. And at our exhibition, we had several visitors that came again and again and again and looked at this exhibition. And I thought about why they returned. It's not really a subject that matters to us living in Kārlstade. We have not been through the First World War in the same way as you have been here in Latvia, and we have very little contact with the countries that Jāzeps Grosvalds visited during his journeys. But for some reason, this was an exhibition that really made people curious. And I think that one key in this was the connection to Kārlstade. We could start this history that was about the world, the happenings that was not really relevant for us, but we could start in Kārlstade with something familiar, with people they know about, the museum they actually were at. This has some sort of connection with a historical happening, and they started to get more curious because when we meet the familiar, we start to wonder more and we want to know more when we have some sort of opening from our own perspective. And I think that this art gave us that. And I think also that the actual art gave us this little opening, because his way of depicting the world is a way of reminding us of how we see the world, as he always meets the people eye to eye. When it comes to especially this painting, I think it's lovely to look at how Jāzeps Grosvalds is moving our eyes around in the picture, in the motif. You see the light coming down from the ceiling, but it's not from one sun standing on the same point. It's several directions in the light, as if he's saying the times move, so the light moves around in the picture. Or is it to make us look around, to search for what is this pointing at? What is that? It's like he's making it more of a movement in the picture through this light. And at Vermlandes Museum, we got a sketch that he made before with the same motif, where the light comes from one point. And I think also that this is one of the amazing opportunities we got when we worked together with another collection, that we could see how the process, the artists have worked through this motif. First, with light coming from one angle, falling down over the persons, and then how he starts to play with it, to in some way confuse us or lead us through the picture. One of my absolute favorites in the collection of Jāzeps Grosvalds at Vermlandes Museum is this little watercolor. It's the only picture that we got where we can see the rifleman and one of the civil. A woman standing at the farm and 3 of the soldiers being there probably to get water. It's a picture of the daily life, something very common, but also about life and death. Because the war is about life and death, and water is about life and death. We have to continue to do the daily life, we have to continue to eat, to drink, and we have to continue to have contact with each other to make it possible to survive, even when it's very difficult. And I also think that this picture is very interesting because they stand on different sides of this fence. They are in the same situation, the same sun is falling down over them, they breathe the same air, they are in the same war, but if they were telling us about their experience of this, it would be very, very different from their different lives and their different role in this war and this situation. And I think that in one way we are doing the same thing when we collaborate with other museums. We see at the same situation, but in very different ways, because we have different roles in this. Thank you.